Regional Science is a flagship journal of the Regional Science Association International, so I thank you, our president, to be there. And we are get a tradition to organize lecturing the two of big events of RSI, which is NARCS and ERSA. But this new team, this editorial team, got an initiative also to make lectures of young scholars, but with a very important scientific trajectory, despite of being a young scholar. And today I am very happy to have with us and to introduce to you Tessa Conroy. Tessa Conroy is one of our editors, so she is currently at Wisconsin University. She graduated in Colorado in 2014. And she's a recipient of several awards in all around regional association all around the world, sorry. I just cite two of them that to me are the most important one, at least up to now for your career. In 2021, she was the recipient of the NARCS Jeff Owings Awards, and the motivation, is very illustrative to me for young scholars with distinguished contribution in the last 10 years. So I would say the premises are very, very, very goodwill. And the other one which she also received last year is the Dan Rickham Award granted by the Review of Regional Studies, again for the contribution in the field. Tessa has a general interest in economic development for several perspectives under a regional framework. And therefore, she has several published research looking at economics of community, development, enterprises, entrepreneurship, and similar field. She published one of the most cited co-author is Steve Deller, so one of the leading regional scientists in the United States, and the research has been published in important journals in economics, like Small Business Economics of GIBO, but basically she's covering all journals in regional science, which is regional studies, review of regional studies that she got a prize, regional study urban economics, annals of regional studies, just to cite a few of them, okay? So I would say, I think we have a very, very, very good speaker, so I really thank you, Isre, for allowing me to invite Tessa to come here, and in particular Tessa for accepting to make, I would say, not a simple trip to come here, but to stay with us, and I am very glad that she accepted. So now, I stop the introduction, I leave the floor to Tessa, and the title of her presentation is From Social Capital to Social Networks Analysis, Incorporating Networks into Regional Analysis and Entrepreneurship. My idea is to organize the session like that. She has a presentation of 1 hour. I will let Tessa talk, and then we open the floor for the discussion. Okay, if it's fine with you. Perfect. Thank you, Tessa. The floor is to you.
Good morning. Thank you, Rosella, for such a generous introduction. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you this morning. A special thank you to Rosella and Roberta and Sylvia for all of their help in getting here and for the invitation. It's really such an honor to be invited and to speak with you all. Today I'll be talking about social influences in entrepreneurship and how we might incorporate that into analysis of regional economic development. I want to start by talking to you just a little bit about my motivation. I think it might help inform the way I approach these research questions. So I'll tell you that I'm a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin, but also an outreach specialist. So what that means is that part of my job is to translate research into practice. I'm working with communities, oftentimes rural communities, participating in their local meetings, helping them design economic development strategies. And I often am sharing this research with external audiences. So I have a couple examples here. One is a policy forum there on my left, working with a federal agency there in the middle, and then working with state and local policymakers there on the right. So often I'm thinking about how is this relevant to communities in my home state of Wisconsin? How is this research going to impact their lives? And the foundation for my role is the idea of an engaged university, where research is shared broadly to inform local efforts, and in turn, local needs and opportunities influence research. So that means I'm listening to community members, trying to understand what is important to them, what challenges they face, and incorporate that back into my work as much as I share with them anything that might be useful or beneficial that I learn. Just to formalize the idea here, I have a definition from the Carnegie Foundation. University engagement describes the collaboration between higher education institutions and their larger communities, local, regional, state, national, global, for the mutually beneficial exchange of knowledge and resources in a context of partnership and reciprocity. So sometimes we bump up against expert model where a faculty member from campus might sort of lecture to community members. We really try to avoid that. We want two-way learning or mutual learning of all parties. And this is embedded at the University of Wisconsin. It's actually codified into our mission statement. I won't read it in length, but the goal is that our work at the university goes beyond the boundaries of its campuses, reaches all members, residents of the state, and there's a large public service component. So again, working with communities. So with that in mind, I'll tell you that when I came to Wisconsin, so Wisconsin is the very darkest red state at the top of the map. When I came to Wisconsin in 2015, we were ranked the least entrepreneurial state of all 50 states. And part of my job was to initiate a research agenda on why that was and do what we could to inform economic development initiatives to enhance entrepreneurship. And from the research, not just my own, but there's so much good work in this area. We know a lot about the place-based explanations for why certain regions like Wisconsin are less entrepreneurial than others. This has to do with things like our industrial legacy. Wisconsin is heavy into manufacturing, which can be antithetical to entrepreneurial development. We also have fewer immigrants, so the composition of our population with fewer immigrants and fewer people, even from other states, not just from other countries, makes us less entrepreneurial. There are explanations with regard to financing. We have a weak small business lending, and that can impact entrepreneurial outcomes. But more and more through my conversations with communities, it became clear that there was a social explanation for why Wisconsin is less entrepreneurial than other states. People identified with the legacy of manufacturing. So people would say to me, we can't be entrepreneurial because we're a manufacturing town. Our identity is big companies, big industry, and it would kind of go against our culture or identity to pursue entrepreneurship. We encountered the feeling of people feeling unwelcome. So in terms of immigrants or newcomers, people moving from other places often didn't feel welcome. And so that's a signal to me about how people think about new ideas, because it's not just the person that we're not welcoming, it's their ideas and whatever niche they might recognize within that community. We also heard stories of people being ostracized for taking a risk, for breaking with the status quo, for experimentation, and for failing. So these behaviors that are sort of central to an entrepreneurial culture were unpopular in some contexts in Wisconsin. And these are all sort of social phenomena that we felt we needed to understand better. So this becomes our motivation for, or my motivation for trying to include or trying to better understand how social factors can influence entrepreneurship and what that means for the geography of entrepreneurship. So already social economic models have proven useful for gaining insight into several behavioral outcomes. So there's a rich literature on social influences. I can't claim to be an expert. I have read what I can, but there's so much to be learned from these other disciplines and applied, I think, to regional science, and in particular for me, thinking about entrepreneurship. And even within entrepreneurship, we've already seen how the importance of the social context. I'm listing here just a few of my favorite papers, but what we see in this literature is the importance of role modeling and peer effects, the way a social network can lead or can provide legitimacy to entrepreneurs. So somebody considering that idea becomes more popular, more possible because their peers validate their goals. The network becomes a really important mechanism for sharing resources. So our relationships are channels through which resources flow. So we might think of money flowing between two people based on their relationship, information flowing between two people, even labor flowing between two people based on the fact that they know each other. And then it also impacts the value of our leisure and flexibility. So if we have a rich social network, we might think we value our leisure time differently, and that can affect our work and leisure decisions as well. But these are primarily aspatial analyses. And what I am most interested in is how do social networks influence the geography of entrepreneurship? So linking geography, spatial distributions with social networks and entrepreneurship. That's what I'm most interested in and what I'll be trying to think through with you today. I think this is an appropriate or an interesting field for work because social relationships, of course, have a spatial component. In that relationships attenuate with distance. So it's almost necessarily the case that social networks are going to have primarily local effects and be different from locality to locality. I think there's space to more rigorously understand those mechanisms. Is it information? Is it lending? What is the role of role modeling and peers? Applying that in a geographic space, so that we can better understand the variation between places and between groups even within the same place. I'm most interested in gender discrepancies. So how can networks, how can social influences help us understand the difference between male and female entrepreneurial outcomes? For example, in the US, we have very large discrepancies between male and female entrepreneurial activity. And I think the social component can help us understand that. Last, I think there's space to link social networks to understanding economic performance. So there's a fair amount of literature, I would say, that focuses on how social influences shape the choice to become an entrepreneur, but then to even go one step further and link it to economic performance. Is it the case that people who have a network advantage, their businesses perform better, and vice versa, that those people that are less networked, be it women or diverse audiences, people of color, does that help explain the relatively low performance of those businesses in the US? And how does that vary from region to region? I think regional science also can contribute uniquely to this literature on social influences. I see us leveraging geographic information asymmetry. So this is borrowing the ideas of Akerlof and his market for lemons and the ways to which information can limit markets when there isn't enough, and apply spatial analysis tools to social relationships. And then at the end, I have some ideas of how I'm hoping to develop some data-intensive paths forward. So that's the motivation and where I'm coming from. And with that, we'll dive in here to thinking about social capital. So I think of social capital as an introductory way to incorporate social influences into our understanding of the geography of entrepreneurship. Social capital is generally a community level attribute. I am borrowing a definition from my colleague and co-author, Steve Zeller, who says that social capital is the networks, norms, and trust that facilitate coordination and cooperation for mutual benefit in a community. I like this definition because it's not just about networks and who knows who and the relationship, but it's about the norms and behavior. So if we think about a community and how entrepreneurial that community is, how much startup activity and how businesses are performing, it matters not just that people have a relationship and know each other. It matters what the norms are. How do those two people think about failure? How do those two people think about experimentation and risk? So we have to have a network in place, but the norms that are circulating in that network also have to support entrepreneurship in order for it to lead to more entrepreneurial outcomes. Halstead and Zeller also introduced the idea of bonding social capital, so networks, norms, and trust within an institution, as well as bridging social capital, networks, norms, and trust across or spanning institutions. I also think this is important. If we were to think about bonding social capital, that might be the type of social capital that arises within a university, within a particular institution, perhaps within a community of worship or within a religion, perhaps within a political affiliation. We have very strong political affiliations in the United States right now. And so forming close relationships with people, with like-minded people, is one form of social capital, but forming social capital with people who are of a different membership than you in a different institution is quite another component of social capital. And we argue that both of these matter. The way we go about looking at social capital and the difference between bridging and bonding is to look at religious adherence at the county level, so very small spatial units within the US. And we look at different religious traditions, and the idea is that you can form bonding social capital within a religious tradition, people sharing a like-minded faith, and that facilitates a network and trust and behavioral norms. And then we could think about bridging social capital as bridging across those religions, that people have strong connections to one another despite perhaps a different spiritual background. And we argue that if religious institutions are a mechanism for social capital, we would see that influence entrepreneurial outcomes, but that could be positive or negative based on the norms within a particular group. So the framework we use for this is a fairly simple profit model, and an entrepreneur will enter the market if the expected profit is greater than 0. We incorporate social capital into the function for quantity sold, for fixed costs, wages, and rent. And the idea being that for quantity sold, social capital almost gives us an immediate access to a consumer base, so we might expect it to influence the quantity sold. Through relationships, we might be able to bargain or negotiate for better costs, so we expect fixed cost savings as far as our fixed costs and rent. And then wages we expect to actually increase, that because of social capital, we would expect less shirking, we would expect higher productivity from these people that we know well and trust. And so the impact of social capital, if we thought about an incremental change in social capital, as long as the gains in quantity sold, savings from fixed costs and rents are greater than increases in W, the firm will be more profitable, and we would expect this increase in social capital to correspond to more entry of new businesses into the market. But it's an empirical question. So empirically, I'm just showing a very general model here of what we estimate in the paper. We use a proprietorship index, so proprietorship being a particular way of measuring entrepreneurship that has to do with a legal registration in the United States. And then we control for demographic metrics, for economic structure, lagged growth at the community level. So again, I'm estimating this at the small spatial units of counties. And then we look at concentrations of religious traditions. So how many people adhere to a particular faith. We look at several different faith traditions, as well as a measure of diversity across. And we think about if these are mechanisms for social capital, they should influence entrepreneurial outcomes. And then we use a spatial Durbin specification and estimation to account for spatial spillovers between places. And our results suggest that religious institutions and traditions can influence levels of entrepreneurial activity, but the influence varies significantly across traditions. So I can show some results. I won't dwell here. I know this is a small font, but you can see the several different faiths we consider. Evangelical, Protestant, Catholic, Mormon, Muslim, Jewish, and Eastern congregations, and you see the variation, that there are instances of Muslim congregations, for example, having a negative effect on entrepreneurial outcomes, so we might expect that to be explained perhaps by behavioral norms or traditions within a faith, whereas evangelical congregations have a generally positive effect. And then most, I think, importantly, though, the concentration of the total number of congregations in general has a positive effect. So this goes to sort of the Putnam argument for social capital, in that when you have lots of places where people can come together and join a membership and interact in a way that builds social capital, we should expect social capital to increase and thereby increase entrepreneurship as well. So it's about associational density and membership, and I think that top result captures that. This study, of course, though, has limitations. It's more of an institutional approach to thinking about social influences than it is to focus on individuals and their particular relationships. We're using, by some means, small spatial units relative to the overall country, but large compared to an individual. If we were really interested in understanding social influences, I think we would have to look at a particular person and who they know and the direction and influence of those relationships. It's also not a rigorous test of the social mechanisms. We argue that religion or religious communities are a mechanism for building social capital, but it's hard to test that explicitly. These are more correlational results than a tight empirical test. So from social capital, I think for me at least, the next place we go is to unpack a particular component of social capital. So we said social capital is the networks, norms, and trust that facilitate mutually beneficial relationships in a community. And here we're focused on just that first component, the network component of social capital. And I think by focusing on networks, it lets us look more closely at the flow of resources between individuals, particularly that of information. And there's several, Minichi 2005 does a beautiful job of articulating, I think, the importance of information. And in some ways, this is a different side of the same coin to what is offered in that paper. But what's important to note here is that entrepreneurs both access and generate information, and that information is shared through networks. So what do I mean by entrepreneurs both access and generate information? Entrepreneurs, whether they succeed or fail, are sending signals about the market. They're sending signals about what works. They're producing information about market niches and consumers that can be observed by fellow entrepreneurs and shared through conversation. So entrepreneurs rely on people they know and trust for information that is tacit, difficult to verify, nuanced, or locally specific. So this is not information that's online somewhere necessarily or exists in a book. It's in somebody's head because they had an experience that taught them that lesson. And that kind of information is really invaluable for entrepreneurial pursuits and shared through networks. What this means is that current entrepreneurship is a causal factor in future entrepreneurship via this information externality. And so we end up with interdependent choices that once somebody chooses entrepreneurship, they produce information, and that choice of theirs to pursue entrepreneurship is going to influence future people's choices to pursue entrepreneurship via the informational link. And that's really important for understanding regional divergence. In a paper I have with Dr. Stefan Weiler, we try to connect these ideas of information, networks, geography, and entrepreneurship. So in our paper, we argue that past ventures generate local information. So it's local, it's specific to that particular market, and it's shared through local networks. So again, relationships attenuate with distance, so we would expect that sharing to be primarily a local phenomenon. We also expect a positive return to entrepreneurial information in the form of job creation. So if it's the case that entrepreneurial ventures do produce this positive information externality, that should result in job growth. We further assume that there are diminishing returns to that informational externality. So that means that a place that has a lot of entrepreneurship, a lot of information being generated, that the employment growth effect would be small compared to a more rural or thinner market where there is generally less information. It also means, though, that even within a particular place, we might imagine that differences in networks could explain the different outcomes between groups. So women, for example, which has been a focus of some of my work, if they are not networked in with the predominant male business network, they might not have access to that same information. And so because of their less networked position, as well as less cumulative knowledge based on the female entrepreneurial experience, we just don't have as many businesses that are female-owned or women-owned. These two factors, networks and information, are going to result in differential impacts even within the same community. So to think about this, we modify a model from a 2000 Leiden paper, which features a search for inputs. So we'll call the search space A. And an entrepreneur is going to choose their search space to optimize their probability of success, subject to a budget constraint. The key components of this model are first network quality. Network quality is a function of social ties. So network quality gamma is a function of social ties SI. So who do we know? We might think of a very well-connected business man or woman as having an advantage in this case. In the US, it's more likely a man that's very well connected. And the information that they have access to is going to be a function of entrepreneurial births, so startup activity, as well as entrepreneurial deaths. So those lessons learned, even if it didn't work out, is a valuable lesson. So the network and the information within that network are important for the entrepreneur. We're going to assume that the cost of searching decreases in network quality. So you can imagine that I can more readily access the information I need if I know who to ask and already have a relationship with that person. Further, we're going to assume that there's an information production function and that it depends also on past births and deaths and determines the entrepreneur's probability of success. So that's, here I have lambda. I'm skipping some steps for brevity, but the optimal solution equalizes cost and the expected value of a venture, VE, which depends on the search space and that knowledge set that is a function of past entrepreneurial ventures. The extension here, which I've already hinted at, is to consider that males have more information and have superior network. So they're the gamma M is greater than gamma F, and lambda M is greater than lambda F. So in the US, again, I'm interested in understanding these gender discrepancies. So if it's the case that there is more cumulative information based on male-owned businesses and better established male networks, we can imagine that these assumptions might be true. What that means for the model when we make those assumptions is that women will face a higher search cost, a lower probability of success, and relatively limited access to credit. But it also importantly means, because of the assumption of diminishing returns, that the average return to information based on a female venture is going to be less than a similar increase in information based on a male venture. So this diminishing returns relationship has implications for gender in a regional context. So empirically, we find consistency with the model that we propose, that we're going to use a model of employment growth to examine our theoretical hypotheses. We estimate employment as a function of those business births and business deaths, as well as several regional controls. And our results are consistent with diminishing returns to information as well as separate networks. So that means we find smaller employment effects in regions that are more dynamic. So in places where there's lots of information, where there's been lots of entrepreneurial activity, the returns to information are smaller. Further, we find that the returns to entrepreneurial ventures are larger, or excuse me, female-led entrepreneurial ventures are larger. So that also suggests this diminishing returns relationship that we were interested in showing with regard to entrepreneurship, that female-led ventures, there are fewer of them, they're further to the left on the curve, so they yield a higher employment effect. And I think the way networks enter into this is important, is that one reason that would make sense is that if the networks are sufficiently separate, that women aren't accessing the overall or aggregate sum of information available in a region. If there's something that keeps them from accessing that information via the network, that could help us understand those differential effects. So we'll just look briefly at the results. So I estimate 3 different models. We have just the sum, or a gendered model on the far left. So we see positive effects of the birth and death rate. We use a multiplicative term to show that the impact of an entrepreneurial venture, whether it succeeds or fails, alone doesn't capture the full benefit of entrepreneurship, that there's an interaction that we have seen for economies in the United States, that dynamism really matters. It's not just that a place is highly entrepreneurial or even that a place has a lot of failure. The places that churn have the highest economic growth. So we wanted to capture a variable or a measure of churn, and that's the interaction. And then we break out those results for men and for women on the far right, and we see much larger effects of births and deaths, even after controlling for the sort of diminishing returns effect. Okay, so beyond social networks, the next step in our research was to think about social interactions. And this is largely based on a working paper I have, so not out yet, but I think advances the work as well. So social interactions tend to emphasize a reference group. So we might think of this as peers or role models. In particular, if you're an entrepreneur, other entrepreneurs are key peers or key role models. And this idea of group membership, identity, and place become really important. So we might think of group membership based on being part of a community. So I am part of this town, and everybody in this town is part of my reference group. We might also think about identity mattering. So again, coming back to gender, that I have a group membership based on my gender, and with that comes some behavioral norms and perhaps some inroads to a particular network. And the group structure of that network, the way people are connected, to whom they are connected, and the direction of influence are all going to have implications for economic trajectories. So a community may become highly entrepreneurial, or alternatively relatively unentrepreneurial based on the structure of the network and the choices of people within that network, or the nodes. And this gets us to multiple equilibria, which I think is a really interesting and useful tool for understanding regional variations in entrepreneurship. It gets us to correlated behavior. So much like we saw in the previous section, where information was the mechanism primarily for correlated behavior, here the mechanism for correlated behavior has to do with information, but it also has to do with influence and looking at the behavior or the choice of other people in your network. Importantly, there's a distinction between a complementarity and a spillover that we'll see in these models. So I actually think these are really simple but very useful ideas for understanding entrepreneurship in a regional economic development context. So with a complementarity, there's a benefit to behaving the same as other members in your community. In the context of entrepreneurship, I think that is access to information, versus a positive spillover, which has non-excludable group benefits. So if we think of me, and I am deciding whether or not to pursue entrepreneurship, and I'm looking at the choice of other people in my reference group and whether or not they chose entrepreneurship. There's a positive spillover in that I'm going to benefit from other people choosing entrepreneurship, whether or not I choose it myself, in that when other people choose entrepreneurship, I benefit from job creation, I benefit from income growth and poverty alleviation. The regional science literature shows us that there are these non-excludable benefits of other people in our community choosing entrepreneurship. But importantly, there's also a complementarity. If I also choose entrepreneurship, now there's an informational benefit for me that I can access. And so that leads us to the correlated behavior. By that additional informational benefit that I access by choosing the same, I think that these two mechanisms help us understand, again, regional variations in entrepreneurship. These social interactions are important in relation to space. So far, the analysis has been relatively aspatial when we've been talking about interactions, but we know that proximity matters. So face-to-face interactions facilitate observation, learning, trust, and reciprocity. So in entrepreneurial networks, Being able to observe what other people try and succeed and or fail at is really important. So again, the nearness, the closeness matters. The learning, the shared learning also is facilitated by closeness. We could think of the ability to observe others as also building trust. So we know maybe that somebody will help us, and if we help them, that might come back to us in the form of reciprocity. So closeness, the nearness, the physical proximity feeds into strong local networks and the way information is shared. So close relationships are often defined spatially, and even though geography isn't always explicitly addressed in the existing literature, we often see that a spatial unit is used to define the sphere of social influence. So, an economist says, I'm going to study social influences, and they're talking about interpersonal relationships, but ultimately, empirically, they define it as something like a neighborhood, a school district, a city as the social unit. So it's implied, I think, that we know closeness and proximity matter. It also helps us understand why correlated behavior would happen in a particular place. That this isn't something that is evenly distributed, that because networks are developed locally, that the correlated behavior is going to be specific to a region. To explore this empirically, we apply an existing model from Brock and Durloff, kind of leaders, I would say, in understanding social influences. We apply that model to entrepreneurship. So again, I will skip several steps for brevity, but I want to relay the conceptually what we're looking at with this model. So we have a binary self-employment choice. You either choose to be self-employed or not, so you choose entrepreneurship or not. And it's based on your utility, which has a private utility term, which is based on your choice of entrepreneurship, your individual characteristics, and your community characteristics. But then there's also a social utility term. And I've already taken steps to simplify this in that I'm saying that the social utility term is based on the expected behavior of everybody else in your community. So what is everybody else choosing in terms of entrepreneurship in your community? So all individuals, not I. What is their expected entrepreneurial behavior? So you can imagine a place in the United States like Silicon Valley that's very much known for entrepreneurship as having very high average entrepreneurial behavior, and perhaps places in Wisconsin as having very low entrepreneurial behavior. And that social utility term is going to incorporate that into the individual's choice. So I made simplifications with that S term in the previous model, but you can imagine S is a matrix that captures social influences. So we could capture the structure of relationships between individuals in a particular community. And the social matrix is really fascinating to me because it has a spatial analog in a spatial weights matrix W. So much like a spatial weights matrix, when we're thinking about spatial econometrics, defines the relationship between any two spatial units. And we could think of distance as just defining the strength of that relationship. A sociomatrix would basically do the same thing, but for individuals. How strong is their relationship? How socially close are they to each other? And there's potential to use spatial econometrics, or those tools, for understanding social influences. If we, instead of using spatial or geographic units, used social units, we could then use those models, I think, to better understand how social influences impact entrepreneurship. So for now, we're taking a simplified approach and assuming that the social utility is a function of individualized expectation of other group members' average behavior. And we're going to assume that that function has the complementarity property, which means that there's an additional benefit to me choosing entrepreneurship if when other people choose it, or to me behaving the same as other people in my group. And then that we're going to call that term J. And that there's a positive spillover, so that non-excludable. Regardless of whether or not I choose entrepreneurship, I benefit from others choosing it, but then the complementarity captures that component, that added benefit if I choose it also. So here we have a simplified expected utility term. So HI capturing those individual characteristics, and then the social utility now incorporates that J term, the complementarity based on others' average behavior. I'm going to make some assumptions about the cumulative distribution of the error terms. And through a lot of algebra, that gets me to a new expected utility function that takes the form of a hyperbolic tangent. And so what that does is then formalize the nonlinearities that can come about through correlated behavior. And I'll show this graphically. So if we have group behavior on the x-axis and individual behavior on the y-axis, if there are weak social incentives, there's only one possible equilibrium. But when we have strong social incentives, we have multiple possible equilibria. And this, I think, captures a lot of how I think about entrepreneurship in the United States. So you can imagine that in a community where people celebrate entrepreneurs, where the networks are strong and entrepreneurs share with each other and their information is flowing, that failure is accepted and experimentation is celebrated, that they would arrive at a high equilibrium. But you might imagine that in a different community, perhaps somewhere like where I live in Wisconsin, where the networks are relatively weak, people are not sharing as much information as in other places, where experimentation is ostracized, where we're critical of failure, that you might arrive at a low equilibrium. So I think this is useful for understanding that even beyond that, even two similar places, if we had two communities with similar human capital, with similar industrial composition, with similar financial landscape, that these two communities might arrive at very different equilibrium based on the social fabric or the relationships and the way those evolve organically in a particular community. So from a policy perspective in the United States, we often hear stories about places that want to be the next Silicon Valley. We want to be just like California. And my guidance based on this work would be don't bother. That even if you did everything the same as California, you will likely not end up in the same place they did because the relationships and social context is going to evolve uniquely. So to explore this empirically, we look at the probability of self-employment of an individual. So we look at one person now. So in previous analysis, I've been looking at counties or communities. Here, I'm pivoting to look at an individual. And their choice of becoming an entrepreneur is a function of their own individual characteristics, like their education level, their income level, the characteristics of their community, how generous is small business lending, for example, and then that social component. What is the average entrepreneurial behavior of everybody else in their community? And we would expect J to, well, we're investigating how strong J is. We know that, oh, excuse me. This might be endogenous, so I'm using an instrumental variable approach. And what we find, I'll show you the results here in just a minute, but in summary, we know that the past activities of peers and role models are an important component of determining an individual's entrepreneurial choice, and we suspect that information is that mechanism that's generating the strategic complementarity. And we see that this result is even stronger for women. So perhaps the network position of women can help us understand the discrepancy in outcomes again. So show you the results here. So these are gender blind results for self-employment. You can actually ignore the instrumental variables because statistically we don't have endogeneity as a problem, and we see a positive and statistically significant coefficient on that top variable, which is the average behavior of everybody else in the group. Similarly, when we look at the choice just for women, we see a positive and significant variable. You can ignore the IV results because statistically we don't have it as an issue. Weaker statistically in terms of the significance, but stronger in terms of size of the coefficient. So for women, it seems that they're very sensitive to what other women are doing. And anecdotally, when we look at qualitative research or research from sociology, women often talk about the importance of knowing other women entrepreneurs in their choice to become an entrepreneur. And we get some evidence of that here. We see it for men too, but that coefficient gets smaller. So the results on the right there, on your right, we see the same effect, but smaller. So that's sort of a summary of where I've been and how I have thought about entrepreneurship and social interactions and learned from the existing literature and tried to bring what exists oftentimes elsewhere in the literature home to understanding entrepreneurship and regional variations, the geography of entrepreneurship in particular. But I want to spend just my last few moments talking about where I think this might be headed and where I would like to go as a researcher with these questions. So the primary limitation for me studying these questions is data. That to actually populate a socio matrix the way I talked about populating a spatial weights matrix, I have to have really detailed information about who every individual knows and how strong those relationships are. So that would require survey data. We could alternatively pursue data about ego networks. So this would just be asking an individual, who do you know? Are they entrepreneurs? How has that influenced your decision? So we're just looking at one individual and who they know, but not necessarily mapping out an entire network and who knows everybody, how each person is connected to everybody else within that network. So with ego networks, that's the simpler step forward, I think. And we're trying to do that with the survey we're developing right now called the Wisconsin Entrepreneurial Climate Survey. So we're asking entrepreneurs about who they know. Are those people self-employed? How has that influenced your choice? Are those people, do they live close to you? Are they local? Are they far away? Are they socially close to you? Are they family or are they friends? So getting at both physical distance as well as social distance, hopefully with this survey. And we see similar work. I've actually learned a lot from the survey on the social networks of entrepreneurs in the Netherlands. So some tools out there for understanding this. But I'm also interested in that complete map of social networks. Can we look at an entire community and map all the ways, all the people that entrepreneurs know and how they're connected to each other? So we could see connections across an entire group. Okay, so you can hopefully see this. So we've made progress with this in Wisconsin. Some colleagues of mine have done this work. So each node that you're looking at is somebody in a food systems network in a community of Bayfield, Wisconsin. So we know how each individual, whether they're self-employed or not, we know whether or not they're an entrepreneur, and then we know how they're connected to everybody else in the ecosystem, whether they're buyers, growers, what else do I have? Distributors, people in the supply chain. So if you could think about this analysis, my colleague says if you squint or if you tilt your head, you can kind of see a socio-matrix in this web of analysis that you could use this information to populate that matrix that I was talking about and then quantitatively estimate how features of that network affect entrepreneurial outcomes. You could also quantify for each individual various measures of centrality. So how connected is one person to everybody else? What is the distance of one person to everybody else in the network on average? So we can actually measure and quantify the effects of network on things like the choice to become self-employed, or what I think is really interesting and important, perhaps on the performance of any particular business. My goal is to have multiple of these network maps where we're looking at variations across communities, because then we could say something about how the network of entrepreneurs in one community is different than the network of entrepreneurs in another community, and then start to understand that variation and even estimate relationships. So that refers to creating multiple network maps, comparing networks across places, and getting insights into regional economic performance. So my concluding thought here is, will entrepreneurs share these data? In the United States, at least, I can't speak for here, but this type of information I'm most interested in collecting is not often very willingly shared. We're asking people to talk about their personal relationships and describe who they know. We're asking people to share about their performance, their business performance, and that can be something that is also uncomfortable to share. And this comes back to being an outreach specialist, which I talked a little bit at the beginning, that I'm hopeful that through outreach, I have built relationships with entrepreneurs, that my colleagues have built relationships with entrepreneurs. So we have trust that's come about through engagement, that the research isn't just for me to advance my career as a professor, but it is meant to be mutually beneficial, and that they would also benefit from having this information and deciding together on an economic development strategy. So this is about trust, mutually beneficial work. And so it comes back to that idea of university engagement as something that is meant to be a mutually beneficial exchange of knowledge. And that's my foundation for hoping that through surveys, through conversation, through connection and engagement with communities, we could actually get the data that we need to more rigorously explore these ideas. So with that, I just want to say thank you for your time. I want to acknowledge, of course, all the good work that's happening with regard to social influences. I'm very much on the tail end of a lot of advances in this field, and just hoping to explore it further in the context of economic development and entrepreneurship. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Tessa, for this nice, very interesting presentation. I'm opening the floor for questions. Over there, sorry, you have to clean up.
So thank you very much for this very wide-ranging, very stimulating lecture. And I would like to ask you something more about one particular issue, which, however, came out several times in discussion, the relationship between gender-related outcomes and diminishing returns. So during the lecture, I couldn't really understand whether, so the basic result that you got us several times is that there are stronger effects for women because they have arguably less wide networks than men, and so there should be some diminishing return explanation. So I wonder whether you got some alternative or side information on these diminishing returns, in the sense that you are testing, using one result to test two things: diminishing returns and wider networks. So either you could have this result about women for different reasons, or maybe, after all, an explanation could be something else. I wonder whether you did some robustness checks about this issue.
Thank you so much for that comment. Absolutely, that's a limitation of this work, in that I'm posing two explanations for an observed truth in the United States. It could be that there's the informational component, and that there's just less cumulative information based on the female entrepreneurial experience. But that also necessarily makes the networks weaker, and that there are fewer peers and role models. So to your point, and the short answer is I haven't been able to think deeply or come up with a solution for how to separate those questions, because they're tangled together. The very fact that there are fewer entrepreneurs means that there's less information, but it also means that there are fewer people to network with to get that information. So you hit the weakness, or one of the weaknesses of the work, exactly on the head. So thank you for reminding me of that.
Thank you. Please.
So thank you very much. I have a very broad question. So at the end of the presentation, you mentioned the issue of the availability of social network matrices to be employed as the W metrics in your special models. Do you, beyond your experience, do you have any information about researchers in your field of research or in adjacent ones, which have used actual social networks, perhaps limited to small communities? What kind of social networks? Because, I mean, in your at the end you said, I need to know who is in contact with whom, but often this is a too high objective to attain, Perhaps in some cases one could figure out some particular kinds of networks that make sense to in your interpretation, okay, in your framework, and try to use. Just to know if you have an idea of somebody who has done it.
Thank you so much for that question. So I'm just getting into understanding this literature, but one example that I would like to understand better is the phenomenon of technology adoption. So a colleague of mine in Ireland looks at farms as the unit of observation and understands how farms socialize or how farmers socialize, and then how that impacts their adoption of a new technology. So we see already these types of tools being adopted. I just haven't seen it brought into understanding entrepreneurial choice. You could think of technology adoption as sort of entrepreneurial in a way, right, in that it's a risky behavior and advancing perhaps an innovation. And that's going to be where I look next to try to understand how to use it here in this work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I have two questions or comments, let's say. And okay, about the working paper.
Sorry, can you take away the mask, because here we cannot hear.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. About the working paper you have, or also about the last graph you showed us. How did you measure exactly relationships? And let's say you said who you know. It seems quite ambiguous. What does it mean? And so what's the content of a link? My second question is about something you said. You said that proximity matters. Yeah, I think we all agree here in this room. And but do you think there is any chance to have let's say, more competition in a setting characterized by very high spatial proximity? And maybe, do you think that this more competition can have some effect also on entrepreneurship, maybe more, maybe less, maybe, let's say, different kind of entrepreneurship? So could you elaborate a bit more on the dark side of these, let's say, proximity matters on entrepreneurship outcomes? Thank you.
I think I understood your first question, but I might need help with your second question. So the first question with regard to how am I understanding who knows who in that working paper, admittedly, it's a dissatisfying answer in that I don't know. And so I'm relying on this assumption of average behavior. So I'm assuming that the entrepreneur is forming an expectation of the choice of others in their community based on average behavior. And the way I'm measuring that is just the rates of entrepreneurship. So in its simplest form, this is an argument that entrepreneurship begets entrepreneurship. So in places where the average behavior is more entrepreneurial, any given individual is more likely to choose entrepreneurship. And I'm assuming that just because that's the data that I can get, but I would like to know, of course, who knows who, and more specifically pin down that relationship. I think in the United States, I have data primarily for large metro areas, but I think even if I could look at a rural community where the number of observations is more manageable, then maybe I could advance that line of thinking. But to your point, yes, it's just an assumption to think about average behavior, and that collapses the socio-matrix and down into something that I can find at least somewhat econometrically tractable. I hope that answers your question. What was the second part, though? Could you say that again?
Let's say, do you think that can you have, let's say, also not just collaboration or synergies or let's say sharing of knowledge in spatial proximity, but also other effects that may have in turn negative effects on entrepreneurship? Let's say, what's the dark side of the story, if any?
So I think I might understand now. So, I talk a lot about information. I am a student of geographic information asymmetries and think a lot about the work of George Akerlof. So I tend to focus on information, but surely there are other effects that could be happening between people in the same place, other social effects. So for example, the legitimacy argument, I think, is really relevant in Wisconsin, where I live, in that if you have lots of people choosing entrepreneurship, it becomes a validated career path, or a legitimate or even esteemed career path. It's prestigious to own one's own business. And so the legitimacy component, I think, is another mechanism perhaps that could lend itself to understanding entrepreneurial choice. And the flip side of that would be if people don't value entrepreneurship, if people are viewed as, why would you break the status quo? Why would you do something differently? If it's sort of admonished, then that legitimacy declines and the choice becomes less relevant. So certainly there could be other effects than the collaboration and the synergy that you describe. I just focus on the one that I think is likely most powerful, but I'm certainly open to other explanations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tessa, for this very stimulating talk. You started by mentioning that you spend a lot of part of your time in outreach. And if you could expand a little bit more on how you go from theory to applied theory to practice in your daily work, that would be interesting for this audience.
So it's a circular process, and so trying to identify the beginning is difficult, but oftentimes I am invited into a community to analyze their economy and strategize with them about what would be an effective development strategy. So we start by talking together about how their performance metrics looks, how does income growth look, what does job creation look like, and I share with them the research on entrepreneurship, that we know that entrepreneurship is a pretty promising strategy for generating jobs, for example. And that's oftentimes a big shift for communities in Wisconsin because they're used to a recruitment mentality. Let's invite a big firm to move into our town and that will solve our problem. So it's a very externally focused conversation oftentimes, that the solution is somewhere out there, and if we could just bring it here, that would improve our situation. And so we often try to pivot towards understanding what are your local strengths or your local assets, and how could you develop those assets here rather than looking external? How could you look internally? And so then we start talking about business owners and entrepreneurial talent. And these communities want to know, how do we support entrepreneurs? And so from research that is from my colleagues as well as some of my own, we can answer that question to some extent. We know that small business lending is really important. So we encourage these communities to talk to their local banks and understand their lending practices. We know that childcare is important, that entrepreneurs, like other workers, need childcare, and that has a positive relationship. So we ask these communities to think about what kind of childcare provisions are available and if that could be increased, if that's a constraint on growth. Broadband internet is also a really big component. So internet has become so central to economic development always, but especially during the pandemic. And we know that places that have superior access to the internet also are more entrepreneurial. So we can help communities identify, lending, childcare, the internet, all of these things that they can do to advance entrepreneurship. But my research keeps going with that in mind. What else can they do? Can they strengthen their social networks? Can they address women specifically and support their businesses so that they get those large employment effects?
Do you monitor and assess the outcome of the outreach initiatives, or how is the process?
A lot of the assessment is informal, admittedly, partly because the time horizon is so long. It takes a long time from working with the community to identifying a strategy to implementation and then actually seeing the benefits. So it's a very long process. I would say evaluation is something that we're still working on improving. But yes, we do try to continue to monitor those communities that we work with.
So if we don't have additional question? I propose to close this session here, so I would like to thank you for attending the session. And thank you, Tessa, for the presentation. I wish you to enjoy the rest of the conference and, if possible, the city of Milan.